Nice. All right, guys. Well, thank you for showing up. So, here are the countries that we will be ranking today. Well, actually, no, let me start off with the tier list. I'm sure you all know what tier lists are anyways, right? But S tier is, of course, the best. A tier, B tier, C tier, D tier, F tier, and then we have irrelevant. And so here we have the countries. So we have Austria, we have Germany, the Ottomans, and Bulgaria, so the Central Powers. And then we have Serbia, Russia, France, Belgium, UK, Montenegro, Japan, Italy, Portugal, Hejaz, Romania, China, the US, Greece, um, Siam, and Albania. But yeah, pretty much if you're wondering about the order, this is basically when they entered the war, with the exception of Siam and Albania, because they're, spoiler alert, didn't do that much, so I didn't really think it was necessary to put them in order. But yeah, all right. Okay, guys. So we will start off with Austria. We are going to start off with Austria. So let's start off with a bit of historical context. I'm sure most of you guys, being history enthusiasts, know this, but maybe some of you are not as familiar with World War One. So instead of merely just placing it, we are going to explain why we're placing it. So first of all, as we all know, right, Austria is the country that started the war. Now, the controversy over who's most responsible, sure, we're not going to get into that. I personally think Austria is to blame for the war on the Central Power side and Serbia on the Entente side. But regardless, right, Austria-Hungary started the war by declaring war on Serbia on what I believe was the 28th of July, 1914. Now, the reason why was because a Serb nationalist had assassinated Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austrian throne, and this is why they decided to go to war. Now, keep in mind, Austria fought on three different fronts. So, Austria fought on the um, Eastern Front, so that was against Russia. They fought on the Italian front against, you guessed it, Italy, and then they also fought um, in the Balkan front against Serbia. So, given that Austria's initial goal in the war was to punish Serbia for their, you know, crime, I guess you could say, of assassinating the Archduke, how well did it go? Well, I have to say that they performed pretty awfully, if you ask me. When you think about the fact that Austria, despite being one of the great powers, despite being a large nation, was completely incapable of actually even um, invading Serbia, and the only reason why they ended up doing it successfully was because Germany later came in and helped them. Well, I think Austria obviously cannot be in a high tier because of that, because they failed in their main war goal and needed German help to defeat Austria, which is a tiny and quite frankly not that relevant country. In addition, Austria barely held up against Italy, or okay, I shouldn't say barely held up against Italy because they fought against Italy, but the point is that there was no changes on that front. Basically, the Italians kept attacking and the Austrians stayed, but they never really advanced in Italy, and so I wouldn't consider that much of a success. And then finally, with Russia, sure, they were somewhat successful at the beginning, but then the Russians actually started invading Austrian territory. So when you take these three things into account, when you take into account that Austria completely failed to take on Serbia, which is a tiny country, when you take into account that they didn't really beat Italy in any meaningful sense, and if you also take into account that they were losing to Russia, which, as we'll see later, was not very much of a good country, I am definitely going to say that Austria does not deserve to be in either A or the B tier. And so we will put Austria in the C tier. Austria, to their credit, they didn't lose much land during the war. I mean, they collapsed after the war, but they didn't lose much land during the war. So we do have to give them credit for that. And they won a decent amount of victories. I made a chart that we'll see afterwards, which shows the percentage of victories each country won. And so their victory defeat ratio is about split equally. So I won't put them as D tier, but they definitely were pretty much of a joke, especially given how powerful of a country they should have been. So we are putting Austria in a C tier. Yeah. All right. So we put Austria now in the C tier. And so now we will move on to our next country, Germany. I am going to put Germany in A tier. Actually, just kidding. I'm putting Germany in S tier. So some of you might be asking, okay, A tier makes sense, but why S tier? Why is Germany so high up? Well, the reason I would say that Germany is S tier is because when you think about it, Germany literally was the Central Powers. Sure, the Central Powers are made up of four nations, but really Germany was doing all the heavy lifting. So as we just explained, Austria was an incompetent ally. They weren't that good. Not going to spoil too much, but let's just say the Ottomans were not that great in the war either. And sure, Bulgaria was fine, but Bulgaria wasn't really changing that much during the war. And so because of that, we if we look at, that alone, that already puts Germany pretty high. Okay, maybe A tier. Then why S tier? Well, when you think about it, first of all, Germany kind of was at the advantage on the Western Front. Remember, Germany wasn't having its land occupied. Instead, it occupied French land, a decent amount, or Belgian land, a decent amount of French land, and they even made it all the way to Paris. So that in itself is pretty impressive. Then, when you think about the fact that on the Western Front, they were fighting the French, the British, and the Belgians at the same time, and they still ended up having the territorial advantage, that in itself is impressive. Then, when you take into consideration the fact that not only were they doing that and fighting the Russians, but they fought the Russians so successfully that they were able to kick them out of the war and cause their entire government to collapse. I do think that that is something that really needs to be mentioned because when you look at the fact that Germany was then able to occupy Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, all that land, right? That's super impressive. And when you think about it too, the only breakthrough on the Italian front happened when the Germans and the Austrians teamed up against Italy. And the only reason Serbia finally got defeated was because the Germans started helping the Austrians beat the Serbians. Then you really have to consider that that's also impressive. And then the final thing I would say as well is that the Germans even were helping out the Ottoman Empire a lot. And so when you add all these things together, they basically were the only reason Austria achieved anything. They helped support the Ottoman Empire. They were fighting three major powers, managed to knock out one of them, and all of this while being a relatively small country with not that big of a population. Okay, you could say, well, Britain and France's population were lower. Yes, in Europe, but when you think about Britain and France having global empires and Russia also having over probably 100 million people at the time, I think all these things combined really means that Germany pushed so far above its weight that it really does deserve to be recognized. I think Germany's main problem, and I think Germany's main problem has always been that they've been super ambitious. So, for example, PKW was mentioning how Germany tried to, well, not tried to, they did declare war on the US. That was a terrible mistake. There was literally no reason to get the US involved in the war. But I mean, it's not like the Germans would do that again. Hint, hint, World War II. So, because of that, oh, hey, Notebook Crusader, nice to see you. So, because of that, I think that Germany does deserve to be in the S tier because given how many countries they were fighting and the fact that they held up their entire alliance and also beat Russia, that's why we're putting Germany in the S tier. All right, guys, next we have the Ottoman Empire. All right, so now I will put them where I think they deserve, and that is in D tier. So, why did I put the Ottomans in D tier? Well, the reason is because the Ottomans just performed awfully. So, when you think about it, okay, in their defense, the Ottomans had just lost, not lost, but they fought in two Balkan wars. They were a crumbling empire. Regardless of getting involved in World War One, the Ottomans were clearly a crumbling and deteriorating empire. That was mostly due to nationalism because the Christians in the Balkans started becoming nationalistic, and so they didn't want to be ruled over by the Ottomans anymore. So the Ottomans were sort of on their way out, but then they made the foolish decision of going to war, and that basically was the end of the empire altogether. So, to talk about where the Ottomans were fighting on a couple fronts. So you had the Palestine front, and so that was, as you can guess, right, going on in Palestine against the British in Egypt. Then you had the Arabian front against the Arabs in the Hejaz. And you also had the Mesopotamian front against the British, who were advancing through Mesopotamia from Kuwait. You also had the Caucasian front against the Russians. And then you had the Gallipoli campaign, which is when the British mainly tried to attack Constantinople directly. So you will notice that in their defense, they are fighting on a lot of different fronts. You have, at the very least, Caucasus, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and either Gallipoli or Hejaz all going on at the same time. So that's four fronts at the same time. But if you notice, apart from the Caucasus, these are all against the British. So they're really just fighting one enemy. And the British were also fighting in a bunch of other places. So we have to think, okay, how did the Ottomans perform? Well, in Palestine, basically, the British won. Sure, they were slightly pushed back at the beginning, but then they started advancing up into Palestine, and then they were able to take over that region. They took Jerusalem. They even advanced all the way to Damascus and almost made it to the borders of modern day Turkey. Then on the Mesopotamian front, the British through Kuwait were able to advance. They got pushed back at first, but were able to then take most of what is now Iraq. In 1916, the Arabs, so the Hejazis and the British, started rebelling. And with the help of Lawrence of Arabia, they joined up with the British in the Palestine front and pushed the Ottomans out of Palestine. And then the only win, as many of you pointed out, was the Gallipoli campaign. So basically, what that was is that the British, uh, mostly, although with some French assistance, they landed in the Gallipoli Peninsula to directly attack Constantinople, but it was a complete failure because of one guy, Mustafa Kemal, who later became Ataturk, and he was able to stop the British advance and basically push them back into the sea. And so that was the only Ottoman victory. But in terms of percentages of how much the Ottomans won, I think they had the worst rate. I think they lost about 70% of the battles. And they also had a lot of German assistance. And so, because of that, the Ottomans did pretty terribly. And that is why I have put them in D tier because they really performed quite well. Oh, this is a very good question. Why did the Ottomans even join the war? So, the reason that the Ottomans joined the war was basically as the war was escalating, the Ottomans were thinking, how can we benefit from this? And they realized that they could either join the Allies or they could join the Central Powers. And they realized, well, if we join the Allies, we could take land from Russia, we could attack the British in Egypt, the British in Cyprus, um, all that. Whereas, on the other hand, if they joined the Allies, I mean, Bulgaria wasn't even in the war yet. Um, so yeah, there was no reason really for them to join the Allies. And so I think what happened is they confiscated a Russian ship, the Russians declared war, and that's how they entered. We'll put Bulgaria. So where are we going to put Bulgaria? We have an A and we have a B/C. Well, we are going to put Bulgaria in A tier. So why are we putting Bulgaria in A tier? Pretty much it is because Bulgaria actually performed very well. First of all, unlike the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarians, who keep in mind were great powers, they didn't actually rely on Germany for support, which is interesting, right? Because it's smaller, it's weaker, it doesn't have a long military history, and yet Bulgaria was actually doing very well. Bulgaria joined the war in 1915, and once it joined the war alongside the Austrians and the Germans, was able to occupy Serbia. Then also, when it comes to the Macedonian front, which basically was in Greece, Greece is a very complicated situation, which I won't get into. But essentially, the British, the French, and later the Greeks, who were kind of forced into the war, were all fighting the Bulgarians, and yet the Bulgarians managed to win a lot of battles. I think, in fact, Bulgarians won almost 70% of their battles with almost no assistance and against much more powerful countries such as the British and the French, and then, of course, also against the Greeks and Serbs too. And so that's why I would put Bulgaria in A tier. They really couldn't have performed much better than they did, and so I think they deserve to be there. Yeah, so common rights, the only thing that really hurt Bulgaria was that it was the first to break all the Central Powers, but that's understandable since they were decisively defeated on the Greek front. And I mean, also, in theory, at least, it should have been the weakest link, so it's not that surprising. All right, so here is the tier list for the Central Powers, right? Germany, Bulgaria, Austria, and the Ottomans. Now we're going to the Allies. So we get to Serbia, the country that started. And so Serbia did surprisingly well. First of all, as we mentioned when discussing Austria, I mean, Serbia literally pushed back Austria, which is pretty incredible when you think of the size difference, the population difference, the power difference, right? Austria-Hungary, I mean, the fact they couldn't even beat tiny Serbia is pretty pathetic on their part. And also the Serbians resist quite well. As I've said from talking about Bulgaria and Germany, Bulgaria, Germany, and Austria all were able to carve up and occupy Serbia. But to be fair, the fact that it took three out of the four Central Powers to do that is pretty impressive. All Serbs won a decent amount of victories, and so we are going to put them in B tier. The reason why they're not A tier is because in the end they did end up essentially being knocked out of the war, so we can't put them in A tier. But for how well they fought, we're putting them in B tier. So we respect Serbia. So now we have Russia. Oh boy. Especially in 2024, this is a very interesting slash controversial thing to discuss. So Russia is going to go into F tier. Yes. So F tier does seem pretty harsh, right? Because it is the lowest tier. But why are we putting Russia so low? Well, quite frankly, it is because Russia just performed awfully. So first of all, we have to take into consideration a little bit about Russia before the war. Russia was a great power, was one of the largest empires in the world, had a huge population, was industrializing decently quickly, and I mean, it's freaking enormous, right? Like we all know that. We know it's not a country that's easy to invade in the winter. We know that it has had a decently good military record over time, and yet the way the Russians performed was just awful. So where were the Russians fighting? Well, the Russians were fighting on the Caucasian front, and to their credit, they did decently well. But again, they're against the Ottomans, who we've established are in the D tier. So not exactly the biggest accomplishment, especially when you consider the Ottomans were this failing, collapsing empire. So that that is already one thing that we need to take into consideration. Pretty much the rest of the Russian fighting though was on the Eastern Front. And again, they were against or not Bulgaria, they're against Germany and Austria-Hungary. As we know, Austria-Hungary is also kind of a joke. They weren't that good either. Um, and so really the only major country they had to deal with was Germany, which was way, way smaller territorially and even population-wise was quite a bit smaller than Russia. And yet the way that the Russians just completely collapsed was so embarrassing. Not only did they lose more and more land every year, but then they performed so badly that the Tsar got overthrown. They had a provisional government. They stayed in the war. They performed even worse. And so things got so desperate that the communists took over, and then the communists um, got out of the war, but then they didn't sign peace, and so it's interesting. So Germany occupied even more land, and then eventually you finally got to Brest-Litovsk, and the Russians lost a hell of a lot of land. And so, given this performance, and given that the only real Russian successes were the Brusilov offensive, which didn't last very long, and the Caucasian front against a pathetic Ottoman Empire. I would say that the Russians get F tier not only because of how high my expectations would have been given their power, but also because of the fact that they were the only major country to completely collapse during the war, and to the point where they had two revolutions. They are going to be an F tier. Um, so, because of that, um, that is where I put it. So we are going to place France. So I will put France in B tier. Now you might say, why didn't you put France in A tier? A lot of people would put it there. Well, honestly, the reason I put France in B tier is just I don't feel like France really performed that well in World War One, given their potential. So you got to consider that France, right, historically, up until the Franco-Prussian War, was the strongest European military for pretty much 1,000 years. So that's one thing we need to take into consideration. I mean, you look at Napoleon, you look at the way that dude took over almost all of Europe, um, and and so you we can see what France could do. Now, of course, within a century, a lot can change. You know, France's population advantage severely diminished. They're outpopulated by Germany. So I get all that, right? I understand that things are not the same in 1914 as they were in 1814. But nevertheless, the French have this very strong military tradition. But yet, when you look at when they just fought Prussia alone in the Franco-Prussian War, they got severely defeated. And then the Germans pretty much do the same thing again, where they attack France, they take over most of Belgium, and they nearly get to Paris. And the French do manage to defend Paris, but I would argue that if the British were not there, I'm not sure if France, or not France, but if Paris would have survived, right? Because the French and the British combined were both just barely able to hold off the Germans. And in fact, France was fighting a defensive war. Now, the French did bleed the Germans dry, and they won a lot of victories. And so we can't discount the fact that France, you know, achieved a lot during the war. But at the same time, given that France had occupied territory throughout the entire war, they got a lot of help from the British and later on the Americans too, and they didn't really ever advance into German territory. I would not place them that high. In addition, unlike the British, the French didn't really fight um, much on any other front except the Macedonian front, and even they were mostly being bested by Bulgaria. And so because of that, I would say that the French could have been better, and so I would put them in B tier instead of A tier. Belgium is a bit tricky. So here's the thing, right? Belgium, they only fought in Europe and then in Africa. And in Africa, the stakes weren't that high. Belgium had most of their country occupied. But I will say this, in their defense, right, Belgium's a very small country. It was neutral. They were not expecting to be invaded. And I mean, they did okay for the size of their country. Obviously, we would not say that Belgium fought well, but I will say I don't think they did terribly given the enemy they have posed and the fact that some of Belgium managed to stay free despite how small of a country they were. And so, even though comment says I should put them in D tier, I'm going to put Belgium in B tier next to France. All right. Well, anyways, we are going to put Britain in A tier. So I will talk a bit at length about Britain because I think it's important to talk about. So, as we know, Britain joined the war because Belgium got invaded. Now, of course, obviously by treaty they were bound to help Belgium, but of course it was a good excuse, and Britain was kind of looking for a reason to go to war with Germany. But let's see how the British performed. Well, of course, the British, mainly are remembered for their action on the Western Front, and rightfully so. I mean, that's where the majority of their effort went. But I do think that oftentimes people forget the British kind of were fighting everywhere. So the British were fighting, I mean, okay, they didn't fight on the Italian front, the Eastern front, the Caucasian front. But when you think about it, pretty much all the fighting against the Ottomans was done by the British, as we mentioned earlier with the Ottoman part. So with the Sinai Palestine front, that was the British. With the Mesopotamian front, that was the British. The Arab Revolt would not have happened without the British because the British were sort of there instigating that rebellion. And so essentially, right, you have three different fronts against the Ottomans and one front against Germany. And there was also the Macedonian front against the Bulgarians. And although, as I said, I think the Allies did pretty disappointingly there, in the end, they did end up winning. But Britain's probably most embarrassing defeat was at Gallipoli, and we've already explained that with the Ottomans. Now, the reason I would not say the British are S tier is simply because of the fact that, Britain was the largest empire in the world, most powerful economy, largest empire in history, and yet they were still basically being bested by Germany. I mean, the British, I was saying the French needed the British help, and that's why they were in B tier. But the British also needed the French help to beat Germany on the Western Front, and then the British didn't do much against the Austrians and not that greatly against the Bulgarians. So if the British had done a little better, then yeah, I would have put them in S tier. But because of Gallipoli and because of the fact that the British and French combined just barely held off the Germans on the Western Front, they're going to be put in A tier. But nevertheless, the British did well. I mean, they were fighting in the most places other than perhaps Germany. And Germany was also helping out all their pathetic allies. So we're putting Britain there. All right, next Montenegro. So we got Montenegro a candidate for C. I will put them in irrelevant. I'll be honest, Montenegro really didn't change that much. It's a very small country, a very weak country. Them joining the war essentially changed nothing. They did end up being occupied, but again, because they're small and weak, that in itself says nothing about Montenegro. And so basically, Montenegro is in irrelevant tier, not much to say about that. Now, we are going to talk about Japan. I will put Japan in the irrelevant category. So why? Well, basically because all that Japan did in World War One is they occupied some German colonies, I think. I don't know, Samoa. No, I think it was the British occupied Samoa. I don't know, Marshall Islands. I don't know, some of these places, like very relevant places. I mean, there's no way the Germans could have defended any of that. They also took Tsingtao in China, which was German owned. I mean, essentially, Japan did almost nothing for the war. And if the Japanese had not been there, the British probably would have done the same thing. So because of that, I put Japan as irrelevant. Well, Japan only fought 3 battles. And I mean, they did win all of them, but again, that's very little. So I put Germany as around. Okay, now we got the spicy part. Italy, C tier. So originally I was going to put Italy in D tier, but then I realized Italy did win a decent amount of battles. And I mean, to be fair, they were also fighting in the mountains, so it was kind of hard. But again, this is Italy we're talking about, a country that's kind of known to be a joke militarily. I mean, this is a country that was barely holding off the Austrians. And then the Germans show up and they completely collapse at Caporetto. The Italians did not help in any way, any other fronts. And overall, yeah, nothing stands out to me about the Italians, and so we are putting them in C tier. I'm going to put Portugal in F tier. Now you might say, why is Portugal so low? Why is it on puts Portugal Micah puts Portugal in A tier because he wants to reform the Portuguese Empire. I actually like the Portuguese Empire, but yeah, Portugal's put in F tier. You might say that's kind of brutal. Why is Portugal on the same level as Russia? Well, essentially because not only did Portugal face absolutely no threat from any of the Central Powers, but they performed so awfully that it really just astonishes me just how bad Portugal was. So pretty much the thing is that, as Common explained, Portugal and Germany got into a colonial dispute. They went to war, and then what is interesting is that Portugal was now fighting on the Western Front, Eastern Front, Italian Front, Macedonian Front, Gallipoli, the Caucasus, Sinai, or Mesopotamia, or even the Pacific. So you might say, okay, well, where is Portugal fighting? Well, they're fighting in Africa, and yet somehow, even with Germany having almost all its troops tied up in Europe, and basically Africa being easy pickings for the Allies, especially the British and the French, the Portuguese still managed to lose something like 70% of their battles. And so, because of that, Portugal is an F tier. They're a complete joke. Not only did they face no threat, and they're fighting in the easiest front, but they did terribly there as well. Are correct. So Hejaz basically is the country that was involved in the Arab revolt. Essentially, the British promised the Hejazis to create an Arab kingdom once they won the war. But we're talking about the British here, who are not very good at keeping their promises. I'm actually going to put Hejaz in A. Now, some of you might be surprised. You might say, why are we putting Hejaz so high? But I would say, when you think about Hejaz, right? Obviously, it's not known as a very strong country, not really very relevant in world politics. And of course, they had British help. But other than Lawrence of Arabia, the Hejazis were mostly working on their own. They were able to, defeat the Ottomans on multiple occasions, even though the Ottomans were a, 600-year-old empire with plenty of history and plenty of incredible victories. While this was basically almost like a tribal confederation that did incredibly well during the war. And then also, when you think about how many victories the Hejazis won versus how few defeats they had, I think the Hejazis actually deserve a lot of credit. So I'm going to put them in A tier. And yes, that will be the same tier as Bulgaria and the British, but I think they deserve that. So we are going to put Romania in D tier. So why is that the case? Well, essentially, Romania joined because of the Brusilov offensive in 1916, because the Russians were doing well. But then almost immediately, the Austro-Hungarians, but mainly the Germans, um, basically came in, occupied half the country, and knocked them out of the war. Now, given that Romania was weak, it's not necessarily known as a very strong military country, and was fighting, two massive empires. I would have given them a C tier, but because of the fact that they surrendered and they only rejoined the war on the 10th of November, so one day before the war ended, that's cheating in my opinion. So Romania gets D tier. I'm not going to spend much time on this. China is going to be put in irrelevant because, I mean, they did even less than Japan. They fought like I think three battles against the Germans, and they're mainly preoccupied with their own civil war and warlords and all that. So yeah, China essentially, is in the irrelevant tier because if China didn't join, the war would have ended up being the same. All right. Now, I have to say, when I was thinking and researching for this video, this was the hardest one for me. Where do we put the United States of America? I am putting the USA as A. I will explain. So I did put USA in A tier, and the reason why is just because the US only lost one battle in the entire war. It's probably not even one you've heard of, but I think the Germans sent some ships over to the US coast and they managed to beat some American ships there. So yeah, the U.S. literally basically has a perfect military record. But I do have to say, despite that, the U.S. can't be an S tier because again, they joined late, and so they didn't really have as much of an opportunity to show what they could have done. Second reason is because the U.S. only fought on the Western Front, which I have to say kind of was the easiest front to fight on. I mean, the British and the French and the Belgians were already all fighting there, so you have two major powers. And then you add the U.S. there too, and so now you have three major powers all ganging up against one smaller power. And I mean, keep in mind, France and Britain were both larger countries than Germany, and so when adding the U.S. right, it's like it's not that much of an accomplishment. But I will say, though, I actually disagree with the fact that, or not the fact, with the premise that the U.S. joined the war, won the war. And the reason I say that is because I think the Germans' 1918 offensive was kind of a last desperate attempt. And I think the U.S. joining really the main impact was not even so much the US actually fighting, but more the morale boost. And so because of that, I can't say that the US actually really contributed to winning the war because it was not really their actual fighting that brought the war to the end, in my opinion. I think that Germans were kind of on their way out, and the Central Powers would have collapsed maybe a year later, but would have collapsed. So that's why I put USA in A tier, but I don't think they won the war. And yeah, Common does have a point. The US didn't really do much till 1918. Yeah, I do think Americans coming and saying, yeah, we won the war, it's kind of exaggerated. I will put Greece in B tier, or probably low B tier. The only reason I don't put Greece in C tier is because I don't really think you can compare them to Austria and Italy. Austria and Italy just did horribly. Greece was coerced into the war. They had the Macedonian front fought on their country's soil despite not being into the war until very late. But they did perform decently well. But obviously, Greece, it's not much of an outstanding country, so I'm going to cut them B, pretty mediocre. Yeah, so we have Siam, then we've established Albania, all right? Siam is worthless, irrelevant. I completely agree. We're putting Siam in the irrelevant tier. And then we have Albania. All right, well, I think we'd all agree Albania is also irrelevant. And so there we have it. There is our tier list right here. We have Germany at the top. We have Bulgaria, United Kingdom, Hejaz, United States as A tier, Serbia, France, Belgium, and Greece as B tier. We have Austria and Italy, C tier, Romania and the Ottomans is D tier, and then Portugal and Russia's F tier, and then the rest are kind of irrelevant. But yeah, this is basically the gold standard. Good job. They did okay, mostly well, but okay. These guys really sucked. They were terrible. These two were terrible, and these just like, go die. But yeah, anyways, that's the end of this tier list. Tell me what you guys thought. Did you like this? I actually had a really tough fun. Oh my gosh, really fun time researching for this, and I thought it was really fun. So I'm curious, would you guys like to see more tier lists? Did you enjoy this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments over here. So I made this little thing. And basically here I put in all the victories, all the inconclusive, and all the defeats of every single country. Not all countries get not all countries get their own chart because some of them, like Albania and Montenegro, only fought one battle. Um, but yeah, let me show you some of these. All right, so we're starting off at the top, Germany. Now, it might surprise you guys to see that Germany lost almost half their battles. But because of the odds that they were facing, I still put them in S tier. Just because of how well they did. And I mean, they did win over a third of the time, and the rest was inconclusive. Where did I get these statistics from? Good question. I just went on Wikipedia, literally looked at every single battle, and then just wrote who was on which side and did they win or did they lose or was it inconclusive. So yeah, Germany. Oh yeah, I should tell you the actual numbers too. Germany won 93 battles, 38 were inconclusive, and lost 126. Although keep in mind, if Germany had not been supporting the Ottomans, they would have a better ratio. What side did Albania fight with? They were allies, but as I said, did very little. Do you know which victory and against who Albania had? I think Albania's one victory was against Austria-Hungary, but again, I don't really remember. Albania did very little. All right, so this is the German one. Now we have Austria. So Austria actually percentage-wise did better. They won 44%, lost 45%, and 9.9% inconclusive. But again, Austria, as we know, didn't do that well until they won 36, lost 37, and 8 were inconclusive. So yeah, that's Austria. Then we get the Ottomans, and oof, look at this ratio. Ottomans lost two-thirds of their battles and then pretty much won the rest with a tiny amount of inconclusive. Um, but yeah, Ottomans, as we can see, did pretty awfully, and so no wonder they're D tier. They won 35, lost 79 battles, and 4 were inconclusive. So yeah, Ottomans did pretty horribly. And then look at this. Bulgaria is basically the polar opposite. Bulgaria won exactly two-thirds and then lost one-third of their battles with no inconclusives. So they didn't actually fight that many battles as you can imagine, but yeah, Bulgaria did pretty well. All right, so those are the 4 Central Powers. Now we go down to the UK here. UK won most of the battles, a good 58%. They lost 30%, and then 10% were inconclusive. But the British definitely fought the most. The British won 147 battles, lost 77, and 27 were inconclusive. So essentially, the British fought over 250 battles in this war. By the way, by British I just mean the whole empire. It includes Canadians, Australians, Indians, all that. But yeah, British fought a lot of battles in this war. Oh, my mic is glitching out. Oh, shoot.
Let's get back to what I was saying. So we look at France. France won just under half their battles. They lost a third, but France had a lot of inconclusives. And one thing I noticed, especially on the Western Front, so many of these battles were inconclusive. So it's hard to really quantify who won a lot of these. Um, what website? Yeah, it's just Wikipedia. I just literally looked every battle up of World War One, and then I looked, who was on each side, and then if it was like British and French versus Germans, that would be one British victory, one French victory, one German loss. Yeah. And people could be, oh, Wikipedia, blah blah, it's not most reliable, whatever. It's good enough. It's good enough. I mean, probably the actual stats are fairly close to these charts. So if you look at the amount of battles, France, they won 39, lost 27, and 18 were conclusive. So yeah, France is very split. And then we got to Russia, and yeah, Russia's almost as bad as the Ottomans. They lost over half their battles, only won about a third, and then the rest were inconclusive. But yeah, Russia kind of sucked during this war. So we look at Russia's stats: lost 42, won 26, 11 were inconclusive. Then we get to the U.S., and this is what I'm saying. So this 5% defeat for the U.S. is actually just one battle because the U.S. didn't fight that many. But you can see they have a really good ratio here. But then when you think about Bulgaria here, which fought, you know, more battles, or maybe not more, but against much harder odds, it's kind of funny that they're fairly close to the U.S. in terms of victories. But yeah, the U.S. 14 victories, 4 inconclusives, and they lost 1. All right, now we're getting to the more relevant, and guys, this is why I put Portugal in F tier. Um, yeah, Portugal. Look at this. Lost 71% of their battles. and the rest was victories are inconclusive. And we look at Portugal. Portugal lost 5 battles, guys. 5 battles and only won one, and one other was inconclusive. So, yeah, Portugal really did awful in this war. That's why I put them in F tier. Look at Belgium. Belgium actually won a little over half their battles. And then a quarter were defeats and the rest was inconclusive. Yeah, so Belgium didn't fight that many, but Belgium was 8 victories, 4 defeats, and 3 inconclusives. You get to Serbia here. So Serbia won half, basically lost half. Serbia split, but given the circumstances, that's why I put them B instead of C tier. But yeah, Serbia won 7 and lost 6. Then we get Hejaz, and this is what I'm saying, guys. Hejaz has an even better ratio than the U.S., which is kind of crazy, right? They won 81% of their battles. So Hejaz did pretty well. I have to say props to Hejaz. Where's Hejaz here? Won 9 battles and lost 2. Right, then we look at Italy. Now, Italy, you'd be surprised. Italy actually won half their battles. Italy is also the last chart we're looking at here. Italy won half their battles, but they lost a good amount, about a third, and the rest was inconclusive. But, Italy, they're only fighting one enemy, and they didn't perform that well. So Italy's 18 victories, 5 inconclusives, and 12 defeats. Yeah. Yeah. So there you go. Those are the little things that I made, charts. And then of course all these countries, right? They didn't fight enough battles to be worth being there. That also includes actually Romania and Greece, but I felt like Romania and Greece did enough in the war that they still deserve to be ranked somewhere. But yeah, of course, as we can see, by far the Germans, the British fought the most, and to say the Germans on the Central Power side and the British on the Allied side were kind of the main players. So yeah, anyways, thank you guys all so much for coming. I really enjoyed making this, and next time we'll do World War II perhaps, and then maybe, yeah, Napoleon, and if I really want to torture myself, maybe the 30 Years' War as well. But yeah, I think it'll be pretty cool to do. Yeah, to see that. And yeah, if you guys have any other comments, feel free to put them under the comment section when I make this video public.